I tell you, I grew up overnight. By the fall of 1959, we had what we call test sit-ins in Nashville. We went through a period of role playing and social drama, and then it came time for a group of black and white college students to go downtown Nashville, just sit at a lunch counter to establish the fact that people would deny us service. It was in November and December 1959. And then when the sit-in started in Greensboro, North Carolina, on February the 1st, 1960, we started sitting in on a regular basis. And it was there that by sitting down, I think we were really standing up. I saw many of us, and I know in my own case, I grew up while I was sitting on a lunch counter stool. I became a different person. I became a different human being. Somehow, in some way, I just felt that we were involved in something that was so large, so necessary, so right. It was almost holy. It was something very righteous and something very pure about it. I was sitting there with other young college students. For the most part, we were well dressed, we were orderly, we were peaceful, and we were looking straight ahead, or either we were doing our homework. And people would come up and call us niggers. They would come up and spit on us, put lighted cigarettes out in our hair or down our backs, pull us off the lunch counter stool. And we didn't strike back. At times, we would just look straight ahead. I just felt that we had to do what we were doing and that it was necessary. I will never forget in late February 1960, one morning we were preparing to sit in, and a very influential citizen of Nashville came to the church where we were gathering, saying if we go down on this particular day, the officials are going to allow people to beat us, to pull us off the lunch counter stools, and then going to arrest us. And maybe you shouldn't go. Maybe it's too dangerous. And we all said we had to go. And we went down. When I was growing up, my mother and father and family members said, don't get in trouble. Don't get in the way. I got in trouble. I got in the way. It was necessary trouble. While we were sitting there, and we were being pulled off the lunch counter stools and being beaten, the local officials, police officials, the chief of police and others came up and placed us all under arrest. I was arrested along with 87 other students. The Nashville sit-ins became the first mass arrest in the sit-in movement. And I was taken to jail. I tell you, I felt so liberated. I felt so free. I felt like I crossed over. I think I said to myself, what else can you do to me? You beat me, you harassed me, now you've placed me under arrest. You put us in jail. What's left? You can kill us. But as a group, and I know for one person, we were determined to see the end of segregation and racial discrimination in places of public accommodation. So I lost my sense of fear. You know, no one liked to be beaten. No one liked to go to jail. Jail is not a pleasant place. No one liked to suffer pain. But for the common good, we were committed. My mother, my father, my mother, my dear mother, she was so worried. She was so troubled. She didn't know that I was even involved. I hadn't had any discussion until she heard that I was in jail. When the school official called and informed her that I was in jail with several other students. The next day or so, I got a letter saying, get out of that movement, get out of that mess. You went to school to get an education. You don't get yourself hurt. You don't get yourself killed. And I wrote her back and said, I think I did the right thing. It was the right thing to do. Years later, she became very, very supportive, especially after the Voting Rights Act was passed and she was allowed to become a registered voter. As a participant, and even today, I have never, ever questioned the method, never questioned this idea, this concept of passive resistance. I believe in nonviolence as a way of life, as a way of living. I believe that this idea is one of those immutable principles. It is non-negotiable. If you're going to create a world community at peace with itself, you have to accept nonviolence as a way of life, as a way of living. I thought I was going to die a few times. On the Freedom Rides in May of 1961, when I was beaten at the Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, I thought I was going to die. On March 7, 1965, when I was hit in the head with a nightstick by a state trooper at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. But nothing can make me question the philosophy of nonviolence. I cannot and will not retaliate. We grew to respect the dignity and the worth of every human being. When we were being harassed by Sheriff Clark in Selma, a Bull Connor in Birmingham, when I was being beaten by an angry mob in Montgomery, you try to put yourself in the place of the people that are abusing you and see that person as a human being and try to do what you can to win that person over, to change that person. And in a sense, we all were victims of a system. And we started walking across the Alabama River, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I really thought that we would be arrested and taken to jail. I was prepared to be arrested. You know, I was wearing a backpack. And in this backpack, I had 2 books, an apple, an orange, toothbrush, and toothpaste. I thought we were going to go to jail. I wanted to have something to read, something to eat. And since I was going to be in jail with my friends, colleagues, and neighbors, I wanted to be able to brush my teeth. And we get to the highest point on that bridge. Down below, we saw the Alabama State Troopers, the sheriff deputies, and members of Sheriff Clark posse. And when Major John Cloud said, "This is an unlawful march," I think he said, Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers, "This is an unlawful march. You would not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And I think Jose Williams said to Major, "Will you give us a moment to pray?" And before we can even get word back, he said, "Troopers, advance." I knew then that we were going to be beaten. And you saw these men putting on their gas masks. And they came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, pushing us, trampling us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. I became very concerned about the other people in the march. Well, I thought I was going to die. I just sort of said to myself, this is it. This is the end of the road for me. I'm going to die right here on this bridge. And to this day, 39 years later, I don't know how I made it back across the bridge, through the streets of Selma, back to that little church that we left from. But I do recall being back at the church that Sunday afternoon. Brown Chapel AME Church. The church, when we got back, the church was full to capacity. Several hundred people on outside trying to get in to protest what had happened. And someone asked me to say something to the audience. And I stood up and said, I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, but cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote. And the next thing I knew, I had been admitted to the Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma. I think what happened in Selma was a turning point in the civil rights movement, and probably was one of the finest hours in the movement. Because of what happened in Selma, when people saw the film footage of what happened on television, that Sunday night, that Monday morning, there was a sense of righteous indignation. People didn't like it. The American people didn't like it. There were demonstrations in almost every major city in America, on almost every major college campus, at the White House, the Department of Justice, at American embassies abroad. I remember Dr. King coming to visit me that Monday morning in the hospital. And he said, John, don't worry. We'll make it from Selma to Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act will be passed. And he told me that he was issuing a call for religious leaders to come to Selma. That next day, and the next day, that Tuesday, March 9th, more than 1,000 ministers, priests, rabbis, and nuns came to Selma and marched across the bridge to the point where we had been beaten 2 days earlier. President Johnson called Governor Wallace to come to the White House to try to get assurance from him that he would be able to protect us if we decided to march again. Wallace could not assure the president. Lyndon Johnson was so moved that he had to do something. The American people were saying you must act. The Congress was saying you must do something. So March 15th, 1965, Lyndon Johnson made one of the most meaningful speeches any American president had made in modern time on the whole question of civil rights or voting rights. And I was with Dr. King as we watched and listened to Lyndon Johnson. The night of March 15th, spoke to the nation, spoke to a joint session of the Congress. He started that speech off that night by saying, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and for the destiny of democracy. He went on to say, time, history, and fate meet on a single place in man unending in search for freedom. So it was more than a century ago at Lexington and at Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. He condemned the violence in Selma, and he mentioned the fact that one good man, a man of God, was killed. Reverend James Reed, a white minister from Boston, had participated in the march on March 9th. And then the night of March 9th, he went out to try to get something to eat with 2 or 3 other white ministers. And they were jumped and beaten by members of the Klan. And a day or so later, he died at a local hospital in Birmingham. And President Johnson recognized that. But before he closed that speech and introduced the Voting Rights Act, he said, we shall overcome. And he said it more than once, and we shall overcome. And he became the first president to use the theme song of the Civil Rights Movement in a major speech. And Dr. King was so moved, he started crying. And we all cried a little when we heard Lyndon Johnson say, and we shall overcome. It was very hard, very difficult growing up in rural Alabama during the 40s and the 50s. I grew up on a farm in a family of 10 children, wonderful mother, wonderful father, wonderful grandparents and great-grandparents. I grew up very poor. But in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, my father had saved $300, and with the $300, a guy gave him 110 acres of land. And on this land, we raised a lot of cotton and corn, peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. It was very hard work. I saw my mother, my father, my grandparents, and great-grandparents. And later as children, we all had to work from sunup to sundown. And some years we didn't make enough or produce enough to live on. But I also saw segregation. I saw racial discrimination as a young child. I saw those signs that said white men, white women, colored women. You go to the little town of Troy, about 50 miles south of Montgomery, on a Saturday. You go to a theater, and all of the little white children went downstairs, and all of the black children, we all had to go upstairs to the balcony. I remember as a young child, with some of my brothers and sisters and first cousins, going down to the public library, trying to get library cards, trying to check some books out. And we were told by the librarian that the library was for whites only and not for colors. But I also recall in 1954, I was 14 years old in the 9th grade, when the Supreme Court decision came down. I thought for the first time that I would be attending a desegregated school, a better school. I wouldn't have the hand-me-down books, wouldn't be traveling on a broken down school bus. The school wouldn't be overcrowded and poorly staffed, but it didn't happen for me. And I would ask my mother and ask my father, why segregation? Why racial discrimination? And they would say, that's the way it is. That's the way it is. Don't get in trouble. Don't get in the way. About a year and a half later, I heard about Rosa Parks, and I heard Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice on the old radio. And the words of Dr. King and the action of Rosa Parks inspired me. I followed the drama of the Montgomery bus boycott. We were too poor to have a subscription to the local newspaper. It was called the Montgomery Advertiser. So my grandfather had a subscription, and when he would finish reading his paper, we would get his paper and read about what was going on in Montgomery, listen to the radio. We didn't have a television then. And Dr. King was so inspiring, so inspiring. I wanted to find a way to get involved in the civil rights movement and become part of it. When I would hear him speak, I just felt that he was speaking to me. Like he was saying, John Lewis, you can do it. You can get involved. You must get involved. And when I got the chance, I got involved. I was not the brightest student. I studied. I worked hard. But from time to time, my mother and father, especially my father, wanted us to stay out of school and work in the field. And I knew I needed to get an education. I wanted to get an education. So sometimes when my father would suggest that we had to stay home and plot a mule, help gather their crops, I would get up early in the morning, get dressed, and get my book bag and hide under the front porch. And when I heard the school bus coming up the hill, I would run out and get on that school bus and go off to school. And sometimes my father would say, I told you to stay home, but you went off to school. And he would talk, but he knew that I saw the value of education and I wanted to get an education. I didn't like working out in the hot sun, picking cotton, pulling corn, gathering peanuts. And I wanted to get an education because I knew I needed it, and I knew it would be better for me in the days and years to come. I had a wonderful teacher. One of my teachers was wonderful. She would tell us over and over again, get an education, get something that no one will be able to take from you. Get an education. You won't have to work like that in the field, making starvation wages. Get an education. And she would say, read, my child, read everything. And at our home, we had very few books. So at school, there were more books, there were magazines, there were newspapers, and I tried to read everything. I was very moved by stories, the history, knowing what happened, how it happened. As a child, I would ask a lot of questions of my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my aunts and grandaunts, and they accused me of being nosy. But I was inquisitive. I was eavesdropping a great deal as a child. When my mother aunts, my grandaunt would come and visit us, I would go in another room and I would listen. I would listen. And the moment they left the house, I would say, what was that all about? What did y'all mean? What did that word mean? What was it all about? And sometime my mother and my grandaunt, and sometime my granduncles, they would walk the road, down a lone road, to see them off to their home. And I would walk with them, and I would ask questions on the way back. And we had these discussions. And when I was growing up, I was somewhat shy, but I grew out of it because I wanted to know. I had to, if you want to know something, you have to ask. I had a restless spirit. Somehow I knew segregation was wrong. I knew discrimination. I saw it. We would bus long distances over unpaved roads during the spring. And when it would rain, sometimes the school bus would break down, get in a ditch, and we would get to school late, or return home late. We would bus past white schools. And I didn't like it. But what happened to me, when I was 11 years old in 1951, one summer, one of my uncles, my mother's younger brothers, invited me to go to Buffalo for the summer with some of my first cousin and an aunt. And I remember so well my mother spending 2 or 3 evenings cooking pies and cakes, frying chicken, wrapping it in cellophane, because we didn't have aluminum foil then. And she would put it in brown paper bags or shoe boxes for us to have some place or something to eat, because there was not any place for us to stop to get something to eat as we drove through Alabama or through Tennessee or through Kentucky on our way to Buffalo. And when I got to Buffalo, I saw a different world. I saw black and white people living together, working together, going to school together, shopping together, going to the theater together. And so when I came back to Alabama, after being there for the summer, I wanted to find a way to get out of Alabama. And I had this sort of crazy idea with some of my first cousins. This wouldn't be environmentally correct, but we were going to saw down a very large pine tree. And somehow we had this idea that we're going to take the large part of the pine tree and make wheels, and we were going to make a wooden bus, and we were going to roll out of Alabama. During 1 week in February, we had what we call Negro History Week. And we had to make a scrapbook. And so you had to go out and find pictures of outstanding African American. Then we said Negroes or blacks. And so I would locate a photograph of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, the educator, George Washington Carver, the scientist, Ralph Bunche, the diplomat, Jackie Robinson, the baseball player, Joe Louis, the boxer. He was a native of Alabama. And Carver and Booker T. Washington had been located only about 45 miles from where I grew up at Tuskegee. So reading about these men sort of inspired me to say that people of color made a contribution. But I think my mother had a tremendous impact, because she knew we needed to get an education, and she would say, study, get an education. But at the same time, she was torn. She knew we had to work, to help around the house, help gather the crops. And my father and my mother did their best. And when I look back on those early years, I don't know how they made it. I don't know how we survived. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach. I wanted to be a minister. And I tell you this little story. When I was growing up, it was my responsibility to care for the chickens. I fell in love with raising chickens. It became my obligation, became my mission, became my duty. And I raised chickens like no one else could raise chickens. I became very good at it. I tell you what I had to do as a young boy. And I was only 7.5, 8, 9 years old, but I did it until I left home at the age of 17 in 1957 to go off to college. I had to take the fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. And you may ask, why do you mark the fresh egg with a pencil before you place them under the setting hen? Well, from time to time, another hen would get on that same nest, and there would be some more fresh eggs, and you had to be able to tear the fresh eggs from the eggs that were already under the setting hen. And when these little chicks would hatch, I would fool these setting hens. I would cheat on these setting hens. I would take these little chicks and give them to another hen. I'll put them in a box with a lantern, raise them on their own, get some more fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and encourage the setting hen to stay on their nest for another 3 weeks. I kept on cheating on these setting hens and fooling these setting hens. We used to get the Citizen Roebuck catalog, and some people call it the Whoosh book, this big thick book. Some people call it the ordering book. I wish I had this, I wish I had that. And I would look at this catalog and just wish that I had an incubator, a hatcher, that I wouldn't have to cheat on these setting hens. The most inexpensive hatcher, I think, was like $18.98. And I just kept on cheating on these setting hens. We used to order everything from Citizen Roebuck. Our clothing, our farm supply, our chicken wine, everything. And one of my uncles, one Christmas, had Santa Claus to bring me a Bible. I learned to read the Bible, and then I started speaking or preaching and playing church with my brothers and sisters and first cousins. We would gather all of our chickens in the chicken house or in the chicken yard, and the chickens, along with my brothers and sisters and first cousins, would make up the congregation. And I would start speaking or preaching. And I said, now, when I look back on it, some of these chickens would bow their heads, some of these chickens would shake their heads. They never quite said amen, but they tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listened to me today in the Congress. And some of those chickens were a little more productive. At least they produce eggs. I was very popular as a student because I was very quiet. And on certain occasions, when they had certain affairs or program, they would always call on me. And even in middle school and high school, they referred to me as preacher. Because for the most part, I would wear a tie to school, even when I had on coveralls or jeans. And sometimes we would have to wash our clothes in the evening and set them to the fireplace to get dry, or iron them and wear them the next day. But my mother used to say, you may have only one pair slacks, maybe only one shirt, but it must be clean. And so we would maybe wash it that evening or that night, hang it to the fireplace, let it get dry, and then we would iron it late that night, early the next morning. When Rosa Parks said no, it changed my life forever, and I've never been the same since. I wanted somehow in some way to make it to Montgomery. I just wanted to be a part of it. It created a great sense of pride that somehow in some way, and I felt things were about to change. I knew it was very dangerous. I read about it, I heard about the bombings of the churches, the homes, people being arrested. I had witnessed through news account the lynching of Emmett Till, this young teenager from Chicago visiting relatives in Mississippi, going to a store, was accused of whispering, saying something to a white woman. Then late at night, someone come and grab him out of his uncle's house, out of bed, take him, beat him, and throw him in a river. That all had an impact on me. When I left high school, I wanted to go off to be a minister. I wanted to study religion. I wanted to study philosophy. I applied to go to Troy State College, 10 miles from my home, all white school. I submitted an application, my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the school, not one word. So I wrote a letter to Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King wrote me back, sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket, and invited me to come to Montgomery. I told him I wanted to attend Troy State College. It is now known as Troy University. In the meantime, I had applied to go to a little school called American Baptist College, because at this college, you could work your way through school. And I got accepted. I would never forget it as long as I live. In September 1957, an uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill, more money than I ever had, gave me a Foot Locker, one of these upright trunks that had the drawers, and you can pull it together, and had the drapers where you can hang your clothes. So I put everything in that Foot Locker that I own, except those chickens, and went off to school in September 1957. And arrived at this little school, American Baptist. After being there for 2 weeks, I told one of my teachers that I had been in contact with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this teacher was a friend of Martin Luther King Jr. They had both attended the same school. He was a minister also. He informed Dr. King that I was in school in Nashville. Martin Luther King Jr. got back in touch and suggested when I was home for spring break to come and see him. In March of 1958, by this time I'm 18 years old, my father drove me to the Greyhound bus station on a Saturday morning. I boarded the bus, traveled the 50 miles from Troy to Montgomery. I arrived at the Greyhound bus station. A young black lawyer, I'd never seen a lawyer before, by the name of Fred Gray, who had been a lawyer for Rosa Parks, for Dr. King, and the Montgomery movement, met me at the Greyhound bus station and drove me to the First Baptist Church in downtown Montgomery, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who was a colleague of Dr. King in the Montgomery movement. And he ushered me into the office of the church. I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I was about to meet Martin Luther King Jr. And I saw Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy standing behind a desk. And Dr. King said, "Are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis?" And I spoke up and said, "Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis." I gave my whole name. And that was the beginning of my relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. And I studied in Nashville at American Baptist for 4 years. And then I went on to Fisk for another 2 years. In addition to Martin Luther King Jr., there was a young Methodist student, seminarian, a young man by the name of James Lawson. He was part of something called the Methodist Student Movement. He was also active in an organization called the Fellowship for Reconciliation. He started conducting these nonviolent workshops. And I started attending these workshops. Was one of the first students to attend. And he started talking about the great religions of the world, certain elements that ran through all of the great religions of the world. And he started talking about nonviolence and passive resistance, Thoreau and civil disobedience, what Gandhi attempted to do in India, what he attempted to do in South Africa, what he accomplished in India. And he talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and the nonviolent effort in Montgomery. And for an entire school year, every Tuesday night at 6:30 p.m., a group of us students would go and study with this young guy, studying the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. We had what we call role playing, social drama, black and white college students and some high school students. And I became imbued with this idea of what we call the beloved community, a community at peace with itself. That if you want to create the beloved community, the good society, or a truly interracial democracy, if that is the goal, if that is the end, then the way, the means must be one of peace, one of love, one of nonviolence. He taught us that means and ends are inseparable. A leader should listen and be prepared to lead. Leaders tend to emerge. We didn't just one day go out and say we're going to sit in. We didn't go out one day and say we're going to march. Or we're going to go on a freedom ride. We studied. We prepared ourselves. And we were ready. A leader must get out front, not just on the big issues, but the little issues also. It must become an embodiment of ideas and try to build a consensus. A leader must believe in him or herself in order to get others to believe in them and to be prepared to follow them. It's hard and difficult to tell other people to grow, to go someplace where you haven't been. I never thought that we would fail or that I would fail. I knew from time to time we may make some blunders, we may make some mistakes, but we were not going to fail. I think part of leadership, you must be hopeful. You must be optimistic. You must have this idea that I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to give out. That I'm going to hang in there. I'm going to keep the faith. I'm going to keep pushing. I'm going to keep pulling. People accuse me from time to time of being too hopeful, too optimistic. But I think being hopeful, being optimistic is part of being a leader. That in a sense, you know where you're going. I know maybe it won't happen in my lifetime, but I know somehow, in some way, we're going to create the beloved community. That we're going to create a national community, a world community that is at peace. And as you pass this way, as you travel life journey, you must do what you can. You must be part of an investment. You must be part of a down payment on the building of that beloved community. You must be part of an installment plan. You have to give your part. You have to give your piece. I didn't have a blueprint. I didn't have a roadmap. Somehow, in some way, circumstances and the climate, the environment, just pulled me. You know, I talk about, from time to time, what I call the spirit of history. Sometimes you have to let the spirit of history use you. And I think I allowed myself to be used by the spirit of history, if you want to call it that. Somehow I allowed myself to get in the way. I don't have any significant regrets, except for the fact that I wish that I had spent more time with individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., that I would have maybe asked him a few more questions. I didn't have any idea that he would be taken from us so long. I wish I had got to know Bobby Kennedy much better. These two young people, they inspired me. I love Martin Luther King Jr. He was my hero. He was a wonderful friend. I remember during the last leg of the march from Selma to Montgomery, we were walking, and I think it started raining. He had a little cap on his head, and he took the cap off, and he put it on my head, and he said, "John, you've been hurt. You need to protect your head. You need to wear this cap." I just thought it was a wonderful something on his part. But he was always so caring and so sharing. And Robert Kennedy, I tell you, I saw, it was something about him that was so dear. When Dr. King was assassinated, I said to myself, I had what I call an executive session with myself. I said, we still have Robert Kennedy. And then 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was taken. The assassination of these two young men was the most sad, or the most difficult time in my life, really. The saddest. They were friends. They were people that I love and admired. I was with Robert Kennedy when we heard that Dr. King had been shot. I was in Indianapolis, Indiana, campaigning with him. And I was in his room at the Los Angeles Ambassador Hotel. I spoken to him about 15 minutes before he went down to make his victory statement. Even today, I feel like I must continue to do what I can. And I often wonder if Dr. King hears Robert Kennedy, what would they be doing? So someone must continue to speak up and speak out because they are not here. Been an elected official, whether on the Atlanta City Council as a member of Congress, I don't think it had much of an impact on me. I don't think I've changed that much. I still talk about the beloved community, still talk about being one America, one family, one house, the American house, the world house. We all live in the same house. Sometimes I feel like I passed this way once before. I think the movement and what I went through during the height of the civil rights movement prepared me to stand up and fight for what I think is right and fair and just. But it also prepared me to be patient in a sense, to take the long, hard look. That the struggle to redeem the soul of America, create the beloved community, or to bring about change is not a struggle that lasts for one day, 1 month, or 1 year, but it's a struggle of a lifetime. And so if you're trying to get a piece of legislation through the Atlanta City Council, trying to get a piece of legislation through the Congress, or trying to change your fellow members to move to a certain, you just keep working it. You don't give up, you hang in there. And that's what we did during the height of the civil rights movement. And that's what we continue to do today. Because the fight is not just for today, but it's for tomorrow and the next year and years to come. Someone came to me, a young person of this generation, came to me and said, what should I do? What should I be doing? I would say, find a way to follow the dictates of your conscience. Find your own inner compass and follow it. Do what is right. Be kind. Don't hate. Love is a better way. Don't become cynical. Forget about your own circumstances and find a way to get involved in the circumstances of others. Try to do something to serve the common good. If I could advise young people today about reading, I would say read the literature of the civil rights movement. Read the literature. Read Parting the Waters of Taylor Branch. Read David Hammerstein's book, The Children. Several other books. And I would tell them to read my little book, Walking with the Wind, which is a memoir of the movement. But also watch the video. Watch Eyes on the Prize. There's a lot of film footage on the movement that another generation of young people, just ordinary young people, got out there and they brought about a nonviolent revolution in America. I was said to read the literature, study the literature of the movement, and don't be afraid. There are many battles. There's so much need to be done. We need to protect the environment, save this little planet, not just this little piece of real estate we call America, but save the planet. I say from time to time, we have a right to know what is in the food we eat, what is in the water we drink, what is in the air we breathe. And we need to find a way to make this world a little more peaceful. Maybe this generation of young people can get humankind to come to another level, to move to a higher level, where we can lay down the tools and instruments of violence and war and stop the madness. Maybe in our own country, we can do something about providing health care for all of our citizens. That some of the resources that we use to build bombs and missiles and guns can be used for education, for health care, taking care of the elderly, our children, the disabled, the homeless, and finding a cure to some of the ills and diseases that impact human beings, not just here in America, but around the world. If someone had told me when I was growing up in Troy, Alabama, outside of Troy, Alabama, that one day I would be on the Atlanta City Council, elected by the good people, the good citizens of Atlanta, or that one day I would be in the House of Representatives, elected by the good people of Georgia, I would say, you're crazy, you're out of your mind, you don't know what you're talking about. I feel more than lucky. I feel very blessed. When I go back to Alabama and go back to some of these places, go back to Nashville, or even in Atlanta, pass by places that years ago I was arrested for sitting there. And now you go back, the people invite you to come by and go back to this little drug store in the little town of Troy. Years ago when I was growing up, we had to go in and get a soda and bring it outside to drink it. And now I go back, the owner invite me to come in and have something to drink or eat with them. It's amazing. Troy State University, for an example, after I got elected to the Congress, the local high school and the mayor and the business people had John Lewis Day there. Troy State led the parade through the little town. The chancellor, who was a close friend of Governor Wallace, came up to me and said, we understand you wanted to attend Troy State years ago. We would love for you to come back and visit, and we'll give you an honorary degree. So a few years ago, they gave me an honorary degree from Troy State. So when I go there and speak, I tell the students I got my education from Troy State the easy way. On July 5th, 1998, I went back to the Pike County Public Library in Troy, Alabama for a book signing of my book, Walking with the Wind. And hundreds of black and white citizens showed up. It was almost like a family reunion. The land that my father and mother lived on, my grandfather lived on, my great-grandfather lived on, the people that owned the land, their offspring, came to the book signing. That evening, they had a lot of food. They had a little program. And they gave me a library card. It took me from 1956 to 1998 to get it, but they gave it to me. And I cherish this library card. I have it in a drawer at my house in Washington. More than anything else, I had to combat barriers, and we tore down those barriers. I just had to sort of sail against the wind. There were strong winds of segregation, racial discrimination. But somehow, in some way, I didn't let those barriers keep me down. Because, I would get arrested from time to time and thrown in jail one day, and I get out, I go right back the next day. That's how I got arrested 40 times. There were people who didn't want me to march all the way from Selma to Montgomery because I'd been hurt. But 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday, I was back on the line, marching all the way. I didn't want me to continue the freedom ride from Montgomery to Jackson, Mississippi, because I had been hurt, because I had a patch on my head. But I kept going. You have to be determined. You have to feel that somehow, in some way, you can make it, that you will survive, that it's all going to work out.